Hello, welcome to another video, and we all know that the unilateral exercises are some of the best to use for developing strength and stability in combination with each other, but how do you know when to use them? Like at times they might be not the best choice, and the bilateral movements might be the better choice. So this video I'm going to go over some of the reasoning behind using either a bilateral or a unilateral movement depending on specific movement patterns. So in the case, these two exercises here are two of the most common ones that I would use for shoulders and hip or glute problems, but they're not always the best choice to start with, and they're not always the best choice to fully strengthen things at the end. So I'll explain in this video how I might do that, like I said, for pushing, pulling and various leg actions. Alright, so let's get into it. Okay, so this first exercise, so I'm going to start with pulling, and the reason I start with pulling is it's a lot easier to develop strength with less risk than pushing movements, if I'm talking about upper body. It's much easier to do that. And now this first one here, this single cable pull, it's better than a dumbbell one, by the way, as well, for the simple reason that I'm showing you here is you can see how much I can really rotate around, which is excellent for my scapula here. So I'm really helping it to move, and I'm also getting my thoracic spine, which is the upper part here, to really mobilize itself. So this is technically a mobility exercise for the thoracic spine, even though it's really known as a upper back strengthening exercise, like for rhomboids, middle traps, and things like even biceps to some extent. But it's also part of the posterior sling, which I've gone over many times before, where I'm using the glute on this right side with the left arm on that side. So it has sort of another byproduct of it's very specific to walking and running. So I can really start to build some of those things there. Now, if I'm talking specifically shoulder and neck pain, this one's a much better choice to start with than the bilateral ones, because of that same reason that I mentioned a minute ago with this. If I go back to here, for the same reason of that thoracic mobility. Often with neck pain, especially neck pain, but even shoulder pain, this area gets really, really rigid and restricted, which then forces problems up into the neck. So levator scap and muscles like that begin to overwork because I don't have enough mobility in the thoracic spine. So this exercise is a much better choice than the bilateral one. All right, so this would be like, in this case, a squat row, but could be a seated row. Now, this is a great strength exercise, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't allow for any mobility, any freedom of movement in that area that we were just talking about. It's actually going to stiffen it up. Now, that would be a good thing if I was an unstable person. So if I didn't have enough stability, if there was no stiffness present, this would be a better choice. But if there is a lot of stiffness present, that's not a good choice, and I'd be better off to start with the single arm one first. So that's why there's no definitive always cases, just person by person, and using assessments and tests to guide you on the better choice. All right, but that'd be in terms of the pulling movements. How I'd know where to start. If there's stiffness, I'm going to start, or restrictions and mobility, I'm going to start with single arm. If they're unstable and just quite weak, or I might have already done the single arm things, I'm going to move to that one. All right, so let's look at the pushing one next. All right, so the pushing action, I would actually kind of start with the bilateral position, being in the floor first, and this is just your basic serratus anterior protraction. So very minimal movement, no elbows bending. I'm just pushing right, there's my protraction right there, and just pushing up. So I'm basically rehearsing what I want how I want the scapula to move on that protraction. So this person, but without any pain or risk or coordination, even not even a lot of strength, just learning how to do this protraction action that's going to be essential for them when they move into the strength exercises. So once I've gone from a bilateral protraction, I can go into the unilateral, either I call it paw stance, but a lot of people call it bird dog, where it's again known as a core exercise, but this, you can see there how I still have to have that pushing away feeling. So I'm actually, because I'm not in a bilateral position, I'm more unstable. So I'm forcing my right shoulder to remain stable while I'm doing things with my left arm and right leg. All right, so this is where I'd started bilateral but then went unilateral, and then I'm going to come up. Now the logical thing would be to do push-ups, but I actually, as per the previous one with the pulling action, I tend to find there's a lot of stiffness in that shoulder area, to basically just trying to protect it. So the push-up, even though it's a great exercise, does tend to encourage more stiffness to come back, which defeats the purpose of me, which prevents me from getting stronger and defeats the purpose of what I might be trying to do. Where again with this unilateral one, like on the pulling one, it gives me that freedom of the rib cage, and I can actually open out, and even better than that, I get that full protraction. So what I was just doing on the floor a second ago, I'm getting even more of that now, all right, because I've got that rotation part added to it, so I can get more out of it than before. I'm getting a lot more scapular movement. The person often feels a lot more comfortable doing it like this than with bilateral. The bilateral will bring in, especially if there's tightness in that pec minor, can really bring in, the dual action will bring in a lot of pain, where this one tends to not bring in the pain. You just have to keep the weight quite light in the beginning, not trying to make it too much about strength, just about efficient movement, really being able to push through it, not generating some compensatory actions. All right, so basically I've gone from a bilateral to a unilateral stability to unilateral strength. Then I can come back to the push-up to now go bilateral strength. So once I've started to get my freedom back and my stability, now I might test it as a kneeling push-up to begin with, and if everything, and there's my protraction right at the end. So if it all feels good, then I can move into the toes. All right, so now it's going to be a lot more load and obviously a lot more strength. All right, and obviously brings in the core into this a lot more. I would be wary of how many I would do or trying to take it to failure. I'd be more about preserving good quality. Then I could move into the yoga push-up, which starts to prepare me for overhead movement. Sometimes this is even better than the normal push-up, just for that simple fact I get more of that scapular upward rotation again. So obviously they're going to need a bit more strength on this one, so it may not be the better one to work with, because it's easier to manipulate the load with the cable. All right. Once I've got that, then I can move into either a dual cable push, which would be the better choice before dumbbells, because again I just have that little bit more freedom. But if I've achieved that already, then I can move into my dumbbell press. All right. So where the dumbbells really don't give you much leverage or freedom at all, and that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to build some tremendous strength, which it does quite effectively. Now I would tend to prefer to stay on the bilateral for a person with shoulder or neck pain. I use the unilateral one more so for core and hip dysfunctions. All right, so if I'm just talking about a shoulder problem, I'm probably going to stick with this one. And there's various methods I use with bands and that to help this one if there's issues. But that'd be more or less for the upper body, looking at the various pushing and pulling, how do I determine which one I use first. All right, so yeah, so hopefully that's given you a bit more clarity on that. Okay, so now if I'm looking at overhead movements, so we've looked at the horizontal pulling and pushing. If I'm now looking at overhead movement, I'm going to look at this shoulder press one, and this would be the one that I'd start with the pushing, because it comes with the less risk. I'm basically modifying my body position to aid in better scapular position so I don't jam the supraspinatus or really get the top of the shoulder compromised, which then brings on more pain and more stiffness, which is what I don't want. There obviously is going to be a lot of weakness with this movement, right? So from this rear view, you'll be able to see a bit better how I can really get this movement to get that scapula to move so well. So as I move to the right and I'm pushing, you can see right here that's a good position there. You can see how much the scapula come around to guide that movement in that overhead position. I have very little chance of squashing myself up in there because that's where all the pain's going to end up. So this is why again I would start with a unilateral movement, just again for that more mobilizing and more control. Where if I go to dual action on these, there's very little chance of any mistakes. I won't get away with them. All right. So with the overhead things, especially the pushing, I'll just tend to prefer staying unilateral all the time because it comes with bigger risk. For the pulling things, the lat pull downs and chin ups, I tend to just obviously do them as dual action all the time. So okay, so once I've got the easy one out of the way, then I'll just work into the heavier loads, but I'll still stick with this unilateral movement where and to minimize the danger of it, I'm just going to integrate it to the legs. So I'm using momentum to push that dumbbell up overhead. But again, the unilateral freedom of me rotating is what prevents me, not entirely, but it gives me a better chance of not like jamming that shoulder up. And again, preventing any unwanted thoracic stiffness that can come about from the dual action. And that's why many people don't like the overhead movement, just because it's so hard for them to, especially if they've had history of shoulder and neck problems. It's just the one that will really bring it on quickly. Now, I arguably could have done this one before that one. This one's kind of simpler in some ways but harder in others, and basically I'm just holding that kettlebell upside down, which brings in a lot more stability. All right, so the load of this has to be reduced because the stability demand is so great. I can add in that slight weight shift to it again, that I have to really control it because the dumbbell's so unstable being upside down. But it's one that I would use quite a lot. Once again, the unilateral freedom is way better than the dual action of, say, a barbell. Barbell gives me no freedom in that shoulder at all, especially if I've got an injured side. Where this one, I'll be able to do everything fine, nothing go wrong. All right, so that'd be how I'd cover the pushing action. The pulling action with the chin-ups and the pull-downs tend to be less problematic. And obviously you won't do a one-handed chin-up, but the lat pull-down, I just tend to maybe stick with a close grip than an overhand grip, just so it keeps the arm in closer. And once they get better, then I go to the overhand grip with the shoulder abducted a bit more, but usually has less risk than the pushing ones. All right, so let's so that covers all of the upper body. In the next video that I'll do, I'll look at all the leg things, so how I might switch to and fro, back and forth between unilateral and bilateral for various leg issues. All right, so I'll see you on the next video for that one.